Through the ages we have moved among you, often working in solitude, in moments of stolen time, in the night. Now, finally, we're reinventing our art for the modern age. Out of our hands, the future of embroidery is conjured. For those who have heard the call, it is our time. Equally, men and women, young and old, artist and crafter, each connecting, inspiring, educating, opening a conversation about history and folklore, art and freedom of expression, nature and death. Each living a life with a needle and thread as the crucial component for exploring our world. For my part in this revolution, I'm creating Sinister Stitch, 13 ancient poisons in mixed media embroidery, revealing the killers in our yards, in our homes, and exploring the legends that, at the hands of wise women, these sinisters were invoked to protect, to heal, and to destroy. I'm Victoria Crowder Payne of freedomofstitch.com. These are the Sinister Stitch Chronicles.
Welcome to Episode 3 of the Sinister Stitch Chronicles. Before we proceed, let's recap. In Episode 1, Dreaming the Sinisters, we took a look at dreams and imagination and creativity. It was also there that I introduced you to the woman drink. In Episode 2, we took a look at my tools and my studio and some of the work of my favorite stitchers. In Episode 3, Dimensional Stitching, we're going to look at one of my favorite stitches, the French knot, as well as one of my favorite poisons, aconitum. You'll soon see the two are very versatile. So let's get busy. Come here. Come on. That's better. The reason I chose aconitum as one of the sinisters is because it's one plant with two faces, monkshood and wolfsbane. As such, I needed a stitch that had many faces, so I chose the French knot, because depending on how you work it, it can be all kinds of people. If you work it with one or two strands very tightly, it's a teeny tiny thing like a period. But if you work it with lots of strands, big and loose and loopy, then it has dimension and it stands up off the surface in a textural way. That's a couple of the faces of French knots. I know many of my students are afraid of the French knot because they tend to end up knotty and wonky and all kinds of frustrated. So, for the easiest French knot you will ever knot, you're going to come up from underneath the fabric. Note, I'm using my handy 3-inch needle with a nice big eye that's easy to thread, and my thimble, which you know is cut out of a Rubbermaid glove. In order to work a perfect French knot, hold the thread tight between your thumb and index finger. Obviously, if you're left-handed, you're going to be holding it with your right hand. Either way, anchor your line with your non-stitching hand. Lay your needle on top of the thread from above, and let's take 3 wraps. 1, 2, 3. Not super tight because you have to consider you're making a knot and you want your needle to be able to pass through. So if you've come up from underneath on a clock, you've come up at 6. In order to go down to make your knot, you're going to go in at 12. But where 6 and 12 are pretty far apart on a clock, our 6 and 12 are right next to each other. So you're going to go down in the fabric
just above where you've come up. You're still holding the thread tight with your non-stitching hand. Don't be afraid. Pop that needle through. Pull the thread with a strong hand underneath, still keeping the tension tight with your non-stitching hand. Voila! Perfect French knot. Every time, I promise.
When I first started dreaming about monkshood, it wasn't monkshood at all. It was a sketch of a man's face. He was sort of a graphite sketched figure floating in my dream, and he didn't speak. He just floated and looked very wise and old. It was around that time that I spent an afternoon at my mom's house with my great-grandfather. We were sitting at the kitchen table together, and I was sketching, and as I was drawing, he would give the figures names, which was really cool. So I drew one figure with a beard and a mustache, kind of an older man, and Grandpa Danley said, I think his name is Oscar, so I wrote that down. And then I did the next one, and as I was working the sketch, he said, he looks like an Isaiah, so I wrote that down. And of course those sketchbooks got filed away, and years passed. As I started to think about what the monkshood portion of monkshood and wolfsbane might look like, for whatever reason I remembered those sketches. When I first started thinking about how to work aconitum, which is regionally known both as monkshood and wolfsbane, I knew immediately that I wanted to somehow work them the same. It didn't take very long for me to decide that I wanted to work each plant on opposite sides of the same fabric. Now, obviously, this presented a few problems. First, I had to use extra layers of fabric in order that I could stitch through the center of the sandwich without passing all the way through the other side for the colored elements. Monkshood is often purple, wolfsbane is often yellow. So I thought I would use the color to distinguish between the two different plants. Obviously, the elements that remain the same are the leaves and the stems. As I worked the piece, I worked French knots and stem stitches all the way through both sides, which ended up being really cool, but a lot harder than I thought it was going to be.
Now, let's talk multiple personalities. As I was working the monk's hood, I knew I wanted to fill in the areas around the face between the leaves and the stems with kind of a loose and loopy, lush French knot mesh. So in order to do that, I made the knots very loose and very loopy and anchored them so that I could cut the threads and fray them out to make a fringy effect. If you're working, say, a landscape, you can make it look very grassy and lush by simply cutting apart the knots. If you're working hair or fur, same thing. We'll do thread salad in another episode, and I'll show you ways to really build up a furry or a hairy or a thick foliage effect. But for our purposes, let's pretend that we want to make a line of threads for, say, grass. When you start your knot, rather than wrapping it tight around the needle, you're going to leave it very loose. I'm going to take 4 wraps. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm only wrapping it tight enough that it winds around the needle, but I'm not pulling it tight. And you'll see what's going to happen is this is not tight because I haven't wrapped it tight. It allows the thread to just loop rather than hold its tension. Again, pop the needle through. Same thing, anchor it down. With my non-stitching hand, rather than holding the thread tight, I'm letting it relax. tighten it down, and what I get is this nice, loopy, raised knot. I'm going to anchor it by coming up just near the same first thread, and I'm going to go down in the middle where I tightened it the first time. So that anchors it, gives it an extra straight stitch to hold it in place. Then what I can do, I can come in with my handy dandy clippers and I can clip those threads apart, and check it out, they just pop open. Next thing you know, you've got grass.
Given that I knew I wanted the fill-in stitches to be very loose and loopy and dimensional, I used 4 and 5 wraps for the French knots on both sides, and I also used both regular cotton floss and pearl cotton, so the dimension is different. It gives it a little more interest, and I used about 6 different colors. So as I worked the stitches, I thought about where I wanted the dimension to be, and I allowed the knots to pile up thicker in those areas. The entire series is about personifying or animalizing the individual poisons. I think this piece will be one of my favorites for that reason. One of the reasons that I wanted to work one of the plants in 2 different ways was I feel very strongly about embroidery as a unifying activity. There's a long-held tradition that often women sitting together, doing their handwork, talking about raising their families and cooking and socializing. Stitching is a very social event. As I was developing monkshood wolfsbane, I very much wanted the piece to be representative of how we all carry within ourselves different faces, conflicting ideas, ambivalence about everything imaginable, and then to extend that to our relationships and to our lives. I've always said Sinister Stitch is very much about life. It's about the battles that we fight, life and death, light and dark, what's possible and what's not possible. All of those dichotomies and the whole spectrum in between is what make us human. They're the things that make our perspective, each and every one of us, special and valuable.
In Episode 3, we've had a chance to explore one of my favorite dimensional stitches, as well as what is probably my second favorite of the poisons, the monkshood wolfsbane. Of course, the woman drake is still my favorite, and she's busy getting fixed up for her debut at the Missouri Fiber Artists event. In Episode 4, we'll take a different approach. We're going to look at close focus stitching, in that I'm working Poet's Narcissus as if you're looking right into the flower's center, and the flower's ovaries are looking right back at you. We'll also look at thread salad, which is one of my best stitches. It's used to create the foxglove. In the meantime, thank you for joining me for Episode 3, and I'll see you next time.